scholars, scientists, geneticists, and others, race is not a useful concept in this way. In the first place, there is no consensus whatever on the number of races that there are in the world. There have been anywhere from 5 to 20 or so that have been identified in various studies. Furthermore, the term race has been used in many ways that have nothing to do with biology. We have spoken about race as religion, the Jewish race, race as language, the Arab or Latin race, race as ethnicity, the Chinese race, the Irish race, and so forth. And furthermore, modern genetics suggests that humans are genetically very similar to one another. There is no single gene that corresponds to the racial divisions that we have invented. Variations in skin color and other features have been responses to environment, but have almost no effect on culture. Furthermore, there is more genetic variation within particular races than between them. So all of this, and there's been so much genetic mixing in the world of today that it makes the idea of distinct and identifiable races suspect, to say the least. If you look at a comparison between racism in the United States and that in Latin America, you can see some of the variation that attaches itself to the notion of race. In the United States, generally speaking, the so-called one-drop rule applied. That is, if a person had any indication of an African ancestry, that person was Black. However, in Latin America, it was a very different situation. Latin Americans had dozens of separate racial categories, depending on the precise mixture of various backgrounds to one another. It has been known as the casta system, and there are these charts that show various kinds of racial mixtures, each of which is labeled separately and with a different name. So the result of all of this is that most scholars these days treat race not as a biological reality, but as a social construct, as something that we have invented to make sense out of the obvious diversity of human societies and human individuals. And so that's the approach that I'm taking today. Race not as a biological construct, but as a social construct. Now, one other definitional question or big picture issue before we get started. I'm going to be speaking primarily about modern racism. That is, the racism that evolved primarily in Europe and the Americas after, I don't know, 1500 or so. But this is a debated question. Is racist thinking modern, as I am going to suggest, or does it have roots in the more ancient world? Is there evidence of racism well before modern racism took hold? Certainly, there is an awareness of difference that is sometimes expressed with reference to physical variations. Chinese historians in the 3rd century BC, for example, described encounters with what they regarded as savage people in this way. They are people, quote, who greatly resemble the monkeys from whom they are descended. This is 300 or so BCE. More generally, however, the Chinese simply believed not so much in this kind of racism, but in their own cultural superiority over everybody who was non-Chinese, regardless of color or physical differences. However, this kind of Chinese ethnocentrism had another interesting feature, and that is that people could become Chinese. There was no inherent limitation on their adopting Chinese culture if they learned the language, dressed appropriately, practiced agriculture, studied Confucian, studied Confucianism, they too could become Chinese. And many millions of people who are currently Chinese trace their ancestry back to people who were not then Chinese. In the Middle East, we have some evidence of what we might call a form of racism. This is a quote from the 11th century, a Spanish Arab who spoke about the people of Iraq. They are of a pale brown color, which is the most apt and proper. They do not come out with something between blonde, blanched, and leprous coloring, such as the infants of the women of the Slavs, nor are they overdone in the womb of African mothers until they are burned, so that the child comes out black, murky, and malodorous. So there was certainly among Arabs, and when Arabs first met Europeans, they thought of them as very strange, smelly, inferior people who were barely, if at all, civilized. Furthermore, in Europe, long before modern racism, there was a color symbolism in Europe in which black was associated with all things negative and evil, while white was associated with purity and goodness. Many words in our language continue to express this color prejudice: black male, black ball, black mass, black list, black magic, black market, black sheep. One historian, Winthrop Jordan, suggested that this color symbolism generated a kind of racism when white Europeans actually encountered people who were black, that they associated these negative characteristics of blackness in general with people who had darker skins. However, all of this, it seems to me, is rather different from modern racism. It's perhaps more like what we might call ethnocentrism, or simply preference for one's own kind, which is, of course, very common. But it is, I think, somewhat different from what has emerged as modern racism. So I'd like to turn, first of all, to the intellectual evolution of racism as a theory, as a set of ideas. And that evolution, I think, results from the intersection of three processes that have been going on in the modern world. The first of these is the expansion of Europe. This map illustrates the expansion of Europe over roughly 400 years, from 1500 to 1900. It was a time period in which Europeans came to global prominence through exploration, through trade, through conquest, through colonization. And in the process, of course, Europeans met all kinds of new people, new religions, new plants, new animals, new cultures, new diseases, new cultural practices. There was an enormous increase in knowledge during this period of time. A 16th century Italian doctor aptly articulated this notion. He says, "The most unusual circumstance of my life is that I was born in this century, the 16th century, in which the whole world became known, whereas ancients were familiar with but a little more than a third part of it." He worried, however, that amid this explosion of knowledge, certainties would be exchanged for uncertainties.
Bob, is this time was the Renaissance?
Roughly, yes. The Renaissance is often thought to have started maybe 100 years earlier, but yes, but the two coincided. So the question that Europeans faced was how to absorb, assimilate, and organize all of this new information that was pouring in from their global expansion. And here, and in the process to reduce the uncertainties that all of this new information generated, to reduce the relativities which were produced by this vast expansion of what Europeans became aware of. Here is one example of doing this from the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant, who wrote, "Humanity exists in its greatest perfection in the white race. The yellow Indians have a smaller amount of talent, the Negroes are lower, and the lowest are a part of the American peoples." So race became a way of organizing this new knowledge. Miles, come on in and have a seat. We were waiting for you. Now, a big part of this process of European expansion had to do with the slave trade. Come on in. That's fine.
Very compliment.
Okay. Welcome. The slave trade had an enormous impact on the making of modern racism. It cemented the idea of Africans as an inferior race, or better yet, not fully human. Now, this is the Atlantic slave system. It lasted for about 400 years, from 1500 to the middle of the 19th century. It transported about 12.5 million Africans from the continent to the Americas. Of those, about 10.7 million arrived alive. The mortality rate in the Middle Passage, on the passage over the Atlantic, was about 14% in general, although it went up and down over the centuries. As you can see, the vast majority of the slaves went to Brazil or the Caribbean, 90% or so. I remember when I was teaching this stuff, I would ask people, what percentage of the slaves do you think wound up in the United States? And, and they said, well, most of them. Actually, the figure is about 3.6%.
Yep.
But why Africans? They were used as forced labor on the plantations of the Americas, in the American South, on the sugar plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean and elsewhere. But why Africans? There were alternatives that were tried. There were attempts to enslave Native Americans, but they died like flies because they did not have immunities to either European or African diseases. They tried indentured servants coming from Europe, but indentured servants were A, expensive, and B, temporary. They were only indentured for about 7 years, and then they had to be replaced. The possibility of enslaving some white Europeans was considered, but Europeans in general were Christians, and therefore it was thought immoral to enslave them. And so, by a process of elimination, really, Africans became the major target for slave trading and for slave labor in the Americas. Africans were available through a sophisticated commercial network within Africa. Slaves were available. In general, the Europeans did not go into the interior of Africa and capture slaves. They waited on the coast of West Africa and bought slaves in, if you want to call it a normal commercial transaction with African rulers and African merchants. Furthermore, Africans were not Christians, and so they were eligible to be enslaved. Furthermore, they were skilled farmers and artisans, so they had skills that were useful. And finally, they had immunities to tropical and European diseases because they had existed in relatively the same disease environment as Europeans for many centuries, and therefore had developed those immunities. So they lived in the Americas. and they were black. And here is something of the argument that because they were black and they were subject to all of those negative associations that were associated with the color black in early European thinking. So modern slavery is unique in being wholly identified with Africa and with blackness. In European thinking, Africans came to be seen as natural slaves, and one expression of this idea came from a strange source. It came from a story in the book of Genesis, chapter 9, in which Noah, after the flood receded, Noah was said to be the first farmer. He planted a vineyard and he got drunk on the wine. This is in chapter 9 of the book of Genesis. Noah got drunk and he was inside his tent naked and wandering around drunk. One of his sons, by the name of Ham, chanced upon him and saw his father naked. He went and told his brothers about this. And they went, but they refused to look on their father as naked. They backed out of the tent without casting eyes upon him. And so Ham alone had actually witnessed his father naked. And for that, Noah, once he sobered up, cursed his son and said, "Your children," and Canaan was a son of Ham, your servants are destined to be, your children are destined to be the servants or the slaves of your brother's children. Now, there is no mention about blackness or Africanness in this story, whatever, but somehow or other, it got transmuted into a biblical justification for slavery, that Africans were condemned to slavery because of Ham's indiscretion, not because of Noah's drunkenness, but because the son happened to witness his father in that unseemly state. So slavery played a critical role in the evolution of modern racism. A third thing that contributed to it was modern science and technology. During the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution changed the way in which Europeans thought about themselves and about everybody else. Earlier, before the Industrial Revolution, the big difference was religious. We were Christians, they were heathens. But now, a kind of secular arrogance intruded, or shall I say, was added to this earlier religious arrogance. After all, Europeans had unlocked the secrets of nature with their science. They had generated a society of unprecedented wealth and military power. By the 19th century, they came close to dominating the world. And therefore, these became the criteria by which Europeans judged themselves and others. One historian put it this way, that machines became the measure of men. And by that criteria, Europeans felt that they had a sense of superiority. They had invented all these machines. They had created this industrial apparatus. They had accumulated this power. They had come to dominate the world. Obviously, they were superior. Furthermore, Europeans came to view Asian and African peoples through the prism of a new kind of so-called scientific racism, in which they used the prestige and the apparatus of science to support their racial preferences and prejudices. Chronology was one of those sciences. There were people known as craniologists, sometimes doctors, who used scientific methods and all sorts of instruments to classify the size and the shape of human skulls. And they concluded, not surprisingly, that those of Europeans were larger, therefore more intelligent and more advanced. In addition, 19th century biologists were intent on classifying plants and animals. And we of course have inherited those systems of phylums and genera and species and so forth. In the 19th century, these notions of rank among living things, the great chain of being, were applied to varieties of human beings. And the result was a hierarchy of races in which Europeans were at the top. In 1850, a British anatomist named Robert Knox summed it all up very succinctly. Race, he said, is everything. Civilization depends on it. Race is everything. Race shapes human intelligence, moral development, historical destiny, behavior, culture. Race is everything. This view now claimed scientific validity. It was not merely popular prejudice and culture. Now it claimed the validity that came from scientific inquiry. Now, there were various forms of this new kind of racism. One is what we might call paternalistic racism. Paternalistic racism had a genuine, if condescending, sense of responsibility to the weaker races that Europeans were destined to dominate. A French politician named Jules Ferry put it this way in 1883: superior races have a right because they have a duty to civilize inferior races. But perhaps the most classic expression of this paternalistic racism, this racism with a mission, came in Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. This is the first stanza of it. I'm sure you have seen it. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. So that last line is interesting, that Kipling saw these inferior races as childlike and devilish at the same time. What this meant, this civilizing mission, which was so much a part of paternalistic racism, what it meant was that Europeans were going to bring Christianity to the heathen, good government to disordered lands. They were going to bring work, discipline, and production for the market to lazy natives. They were going to bring a measure of education to the ignorant and illiterate, clothing to the naked, healthcare to the sick, all of this while suppressing native customs that did not conform with European ways of living. In European thinking, this was progress. This was civilization. It was also racism. Now, there was also a harsher form of racism that got going in the later 19th century. It's known as social Darwinism. It applied Darwin's concepts of natural selection and survival of the fittest. It applied that to human beings. And it implied that European dominance inevitably led to the displacement or destruction of backward or unfit races. And it made imperialism and war and aggression generally seem natural and progressive because it weeded out the weaker races and allowed the stronger to flourish. Writing in 1854, an Australian settler put it this way: the question comes to this: which has the better right? Really, I think it should be who has the better right? The savage born in a country which he runs over but can scarcely be said to occupy, or the civilized man who comes to introduce into this unproductive country the industry which supports life? His answer was obvious from the question. In 1884, a Harvard dean named Nathaniel Shaler claimed that blacks were becoming extinct and that this demonstrated their inferiority, and it was a natural process. the whole science of eugenics, which became quite popular in the early 20th century here and elsewhere, aimed at improving the human race by getting rid of undesirable and inferior races. It took expression in the US in the form of involuntary sterilization. One source that I read said that at least 60,000 people in 30 states were involuntarily sterilized on racial grounds, up through the 1970s. There was also the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. It was legislation which completely eliminated the possibilities for Asians to migrate into the United States. It also favored Northern and Western Europeans over those from the southern and eastern parts of Europe, and it was widely espoused and supported by people in this eugenics movement. One of them, in fact, said, we need to make permanent the current racial division of the country. They did not want to expand the number of undesirables or inferior peoples from Asia or from Greece and Italy and Eastern Europe. Okay. So much for the ideology of racism. I'd like to turn now to racism in practice. What did it look like? One expression of racism in practice. Oh, and I want to add that all of this now is post-slavery. Slavery ended, but racism did not. So that while slavery may have contributed to racism, it was not necessary for racism to persist. One concrete expression of racism is in what some scholars refer to as overtly racist regimes, 3 of them in particular, that emerged after slavery. The earliest was our own Jim Crow South, from roughly, the 1880s after Reconstruction up until after the Second World War. The Jim Crow South featured, of course, racial segregation, both in cities and elsewhere. It featured the sharp restrictions on Black voting, which had been constitutionally permitted, but never got very far. It made African Americans into a lower caste. It was accompanied by extreme racist propaganda, Black men lusting after white women especially, widespread lynching, racial segregation. One of the most interesting expressions of this racism came after African American troops came home following the Second World War and encountered this kind of thing after they had been fighting for freedom, democracy, and human rights. Langston Hughes put it this way in a poem in 1943. You tell me Hitler is a mighty bad man. I guess he took lessons from the Ku Klux Klan. I ask you this question because I got to know how long I got to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow.
Civil War too.
I'm sorry?
I said African Americans, they fought in the Civil War.
Yes, yes, indeed. A second overtly racist regime, of course, was Nazi Germany, which carried its racism to the extreme limits of actually annihilating the racial enemy. The Nazis drew on a long tradition of German and European anti-Semitism. They did not invite it. They did not invent it. It had been around for a long time. And they drew on this scientific racism, which defined Jews as a race, not simply a different culture or religion, but as a race. For Hitler and the Nazis, Jews expressed the urban, capitalist, and foreign influences which were undermining German culture. Jews were blamed for Germany's defeat in World War I, as well as for the Great Depression. And Hitler, of course, called for racial purification of Germany in vitriolic terms, with which you are, I'm sure, familiar. Just a few words from Hitler here. Everything in this world that is not of good race is chaff. All occurrences in world history, for better and for worse, are simply the expression of the racial instinct for self-preservation. The Jews represent the most formidable opponents of the Arabs, of the Aryans. The black-haired Jewish youth, satanic joy in his face, lurks in wait for the unsuspecting girl whom he defiles with his blood, stealing her from his own people, stealing her from her people. And the outcome, of course, was the Holocaust. Obviously, an expression of racism in an overtly racist regime. A third overtly racist regime was apartheid South Africa. It officially came into existence in 1948 with the passing of apartheid legislation, although it drew on a long history of racism in South Africa. Like the others, like Jim Crow South and Hitler's Germany, it focused on racial purity. Everybody in South Africa after 1948 was legally defined as one of four races. You were white, you were black, you were colored, which refers to some racial mixture, or you were Asian or Indian. Legislation in South Africa forbade marriage and sex across racial lines. It segregated residential areas. Africans were confined to what were referred to as Bantustans. They are similar to American reservations for Native Americans. The apartheid regime spoke of something they called separate development, and separate it certainly was. It was also highly unequal. It reserved 88% of the land in South Africa for the whites, who represented about 20% of the population. And segregated housing, especially in the urban areas, was considered essential. Africans were drawn into the South African economy, and I should add that by this point in time, the South African economy was highly industrialized. It was a modern industrial economy, which depended on cheap black labor in the mines, in the factories, on the farms or plantations. And in those areas, the African laborers that were brought in were forbidden to bring their families, were forbidden to form families and to stay permanently. They rotated back to the Bantustans for a time so that they would not be able to form a permanent presence in those areas. To the South African leader at the time, he said this: if the principle of permanent residence for the black man in areas of white is accepted, then it is the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it in this country. So racism found expression in these overtly racist regimes, but it also found expression in the colonies, even in the absence of this kind of harsh legislation. Come on.
Is it working?
No. There, okay. In the 19th and 20th century, European empires spread widely in Africa and Asia. You can see this on the map. And the Russian Empire spread across Northern Asia as well. And in these colonized areas, race was a central principle. The colonizers and the colonized were defined racially, and maintaining the separation of those races was a central element in colonial life. These pictures illustrate, this one is from Africa, that one's from India. It illustrates the sense of distance between the rulers and the ruled. And so colonial policy was focused on maintaining the difference, colonial policy and practice. One way of doing this came with the denigration of native cultures, which were characterized as backward, primitive, uncivilized, lazy, and so forth. Now, all of this registered with a small class of educated Europeans of European educated Asians and Africans, and they responded to it. In 1920, a fellow named James Aggery from West Africa wrote this: "My people of Africa, we were created in the image of God, but Europeans have made us to think that we were chickens, and we still think we are, but we are eagles. Stretch forth your wings and fly." Perhaps the most significant arena in which the races might become too close had to do with sexual relationships. And so any breaching of this difference between white and non-white in sexual terms, marriage, rape, consensual sex, was a really big deal. And it comes out in all sorts of ways. If you've read the novel A Passage to India by E.M. Forster, a major theme of that is the accusations of an Indian man of rape, in a way that's not so different from what we read about in To Kill a Mockingbird. Suzanne and I have recently been watching The Jewel in the Crown, that dramatization of the Raj Quartet, and it features the case of an Indian man falsely accused of raping an English woman, and that whole scenario played out over many years. Political power, of course, was racially structured. Colonial societies limited political power to Europeans, and resistance to it was harshly suppressed. Let me give you an example from German Southwest Africa. The Germans had a colony in Southwest Africa up until the First World War. And in 1904, there was a revolt of the Herero people, which was harshly suppressed. The German commander said this: "Every Herero, with or without a gun, with or without cattle, will be shot. I will no longer spare women and children." 80% of them perished in the course of the suppression of this rebellion between 1904 and 1908. Many scholars have come to regard this as the first genocide of the 20th century. And the Germans are still in the process of apologizing and negotiating reparations with the government of Namibia, which occupies the former space of the German colony. Personal interactions in the colonial setting also featured this kind of racism. In East Africa, Europeans frequently referred to African men as boys, and Africans were supposed to refer to their European men as bwana, or master. I had an interesting experience of this myself, actually, in 1967. I was in Kenya on leave from my time in the Peace Corps in Ethiopia, and a couple of us were hitchhiking across Kenya, and we were picked up by a European settler who was very friendly to us. This is just 4 years after Kenya became an independent country. And at one point in the drive, we stopped at a lookout to look at a scene of the Rift Valley, I think it was, and there were some young kids there selling baskets and so forth. Well, they spoke to us in perfect English, My settler driver responded to them in Swahili. You didn't speak to Africans in English. That was to bridge the gap too much. It's also interesting that another expression of this European racism is a reluctance to share the best that Europe had to offer. There's an interesting case in India in the early 19th century where the British at that time it was the British East India Company, proposed to open a Hindu school where they would teach traditional Hindu philosophy. A fellow named Ram Mohan Roy was very agitated about this. He was a very well educated, both in Hindu and in European cultures. And he opposed this kind of a school teaching traditional Indian subjects in Sanskrit. He said, what we need is science. What we need is the English language. What we need is the best of what you offer, not rehearsing what we've already got in abundance. And so he was pointing to the reluctance of Europeans to share with Indians, in this case, what they had to offer. In my own research, I came across a number of instances where teachers and students in mission schools went on strike because they were not being taught English. Okay, so those are the major expressions of racism. First of all, in the overtly racist regimes. Second, in the colonial societies of Asia and Africa, racism was a central feature. Now, racism in retreat. After World War II, racism, globally speaking, seemed to be in retreat. In the first place, the horror of the Holocaust gave, well, a lot of people have said Hitler gave race a bad name, or gave racism a bad name. Furthermore, the United Nations, which was established in 1945, registered this global rejection of racism in a number of its documents and statements that you can read here. The Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, all human beings are free and equal in dignity and rights. And then in 1965, there was this International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So the UN registered and endorsed this rejection of racism. Furthermore, the whole movement of decolonization that spread over the Asian and African world in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s was sharply critical of racism. And it received support in this criticism of European racism and imperialism from the international prestige of the United Nations. It was supported both by the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as the United Nations. And it represented a rejection of racism. I mean, much of the anti-colonial independence movements were informed by an explicit rejection of racist thinking. In this country, the US civil rights movement, the violence that was associated with it, and the legislation that emerged from it was a direct attack on racism. I suppose that many of us are of an age where we remember Martin Luther King's March on Washington in 1963. And his I Have a Dream speech. And some 20 years after that, we elected twice a Black president. I suspect that many people felt that we had turned a corner on racism. And that scene there on the right of the Obama and his wife and children marching out on that stage in Grant Park in Chicago was a memory that few of us will soon forget. So all of this reflects a retreat of racism in the decades after the Second World War. Sadly, that is not the end of the story, because racism has been persistent and resilient, even though it has lost its legitimacy in the public arena. Many scholars now speak about institutional or systemic racism, in which racial and ethnic groups can be disadvantaged not so much by outright prejudice and bigotry as by policies, practices, economic, legal, and political structures that embody or enmesh race within their policies. For example, public school budgets are related to property values, so that areas of poverty wind up with inferior schools, and those areas happen, not coincidentally, to be populated largely by Blacks or Hispanics or other minorities. And of course, we know that large differences in income and wealth persist. Critical race theory, which has been so much in the news these days and so criticized, and I believe it's forbidden in certain parts of the country to even mention it or teach it, is simply a recognition that that racial disadvantage is not merely the product of of individual bias or prejudice, but something that is embedded in legal systems and policies. But there has been no shortage of the continuation of racism at a popular level, with or without the theory of racism behind it, expressed in racial harassment, violent attacks, coded political messages, hate crimes, and so forth. I read about a recent poll that showed that 1 in 3 Asian Americans faced racial abuse this past year. We know that after 9/11, there was a huge increase in anti-Muslim feeling and behavior in this country. The recent war in Israel and Palestine has resulted in rising anti-Semitism, and some 70% of Black Americans say they have personally experienced racial discrimination. So racism is not dead in this country. And it's not only in this country. This suggests that a number of minorities in Europe have also experienced racism as migration into Europe from the Mediterranean, from the Middle East, from Africa, has increased in recent decades. The recent election in Holland is an interesting straw in this wind, where an anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim party did surprisingly well. Similar things in Italy and Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere.
Immigration issues here.
Yes, and here as well. Chinese repression of the Uyghurs has a racial dimension to it. They are non-Chinese who would prefer to remain non-Chinese. The Hindu-Muslim conflict in Africa, although framed in religious terms, has some of the characteristics of racism in that religious identity is generally thought to be permanent and to mark Muslims as inferior. And even in Africa itself, slavery in the West African country of Niger is fairly widespread. Conflict between Arab and African peoples in that country and other parts of West Africa also continues. So I'd like to close with a question that we might want to ponder. It has been 158 years since the end of slavery. It has been 78 years since the end of World War II and the Holocaust. It has been 58 years since the civil rights movement was at its height. And it has been 15 years since we elected a Black president. Why then are we still discussing this?
Prejudice. Prejudice.
And what accounts for the persistence of this prejudice, even after all of these, even after slavery is gone, after the civil rights legislation, after a Black president? What accounts for its persistence? So let me stop here and see if you have comments or observations.
I just want to remind everybody that this is for our online audience and does not project sound here in the room. So if you can speak up so everybody in the room can hear you, and then speak into this so the online audience can hear you.
I think now it's used a lot as distraction also. I mean, if we're really looking, or we're not looking at climate change, you know, race isn't gonna be an issue if we're all dead.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's
Yeah.
like, I think there's an ability to control people, you know, with the media, with power, with some of the political parties and national council policy. I mean, there's all these different groups that are here to, a lot of Christian groups, you know, that are definitely here to keep the white population, you know, the more righteous population above all others, to the detriment of everyone. And so I think it's power grab.
The Native American people, you didn't mention too much about them.
No.
And that,
Can't hear you, sorry.
Yeah.
the Native American people, also is a huge genocide. And still to see how they live and how they're trying to live with what's given them, which is precious little. We haven't solved that at all.
Right.
We've completely almost destroyed their culture. That's not gonna go away until we fix it.
I think there are a couple of major sources of this return to racism as an issue. And one of them is that when all those wonderful things happened, they were not all of us. There were 49% of the people, or 48 or 47% of the people who didn't go along with that, didn't go along with those changes. And I, like many of us, over the years, the intervening years, began to think it was something of the past. And yet, every once in a while, I would run into someone who would say something horribly racist. It was still there, and it is, you could sense it was passed on. It's not human nature, it's something else. But it would be passed on from father to son to grandson, just in the comments over breakfast.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And it kept it going, and those people got more and more angry, and now they're expressing themselves.
Yeah.
Second thing, I think, that keying a little bit off what you said, we may be heading into a time in which, because of climate change, resources become less and less available to everyone. And something I read probably 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, predicted that all the people on the planet will be fighting over increasingly fighting over resources such as water, tillable land, and all those things. And racism as an issue between people will come up to be used to justify one country or one area taking over another.
Okay.
I want to reiterate, I think the racism persisting it's because it's endemic in society. We don't even realize it's around us all the way. I listen to a lot of parenting podcasts, and there was one recently where it was an academic who studies children, and she was actually looking at racism, and she said the year before President Obama was elected, they went around to white, black, all kids in the US, and they went around and they were asking them, so why do you think there hasn't been a black president before? And a third of the kids, regardless of their race, said, oh, it's against the law.
Oh,
And that like kind of startled me. So it's endemic. So I think like other people have commented, it's because it's endemic in the society. It's even if there's certain people not talking about it, it's still structurally there.
okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a quick question.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah,
Some of us are hard of hearing.
sorry. I just wanted to ask, how do you think the internet and like social media has overall affected like racism? And do you think it's increased it or helped decrease it overall? Just out of curiosity.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, he's interested in how social media has affected racism. Has it made it more widespread? Has it enabled people to peddle racist views in a more widespread way, or has it diminished it? I don't know how to quantify that,
It's a very good question.
but I think you can probably find examples of it on both sides. You know, Musk has a bigger platform than the rest of us. And when he makes one of his strange comments, it is very widespread and gives encouragement to people who believe in that way. Miles?
So first off, I just wanted to point out.
Yes.
I do have a question, and I first off wanted to point out that I've been reading a little bit about climate change too. And it's not quite as dire as we sometimes make it, like we've actually slowed warming. The predictions for how much the earth is going to warm have gone down based on environmental acts. It's definitely a problem, but I don't think it's entirely hopeless. And we've also seen countries maybe with fewer issues with like exploding population, and so we may not have like tons and tons of population as an issue. We're seeing more because as more and more countries come up into the middle class, it's birth rates tend to be lower, I believe. I could be wrong about this. Also, we do need to, obviously, to some extent, the middle classes tends to be more of an expender of resources. Like poorer countries don't expend as many resources per person. So obviously, we should also take that into consideration. Like, yes, but it's not quite as dire as you think it. And I also wanted to ask, some states in this country apply critical race theory. It's maybe not indirect or maybe not directly, but they apply critical race theory as a part of their economics. So for instance, like donations to minorities and whatnot. Do you think that helps at all with racism, and did it help at all with kind of slowing that part of our economy?
Can you sum up the question?
Yeah.
It was a very long.
Yes. It has to do with whether critical race theory being taught in schools helps address racism or not.
Could you redefine just that critical race theory again?
It's simply the observation that it is not simply personal bias and prejudice.
Okay.
That racism is baked into a lot of policies, legal systems, economic structures, and so forth. And it seems to me a rather obvious observation. And it's a little strange that it's so controversial. But I do think that it helps to expose, it helps us to get rid of the notion that racism is only a matter of personal bias and prejudice. that it can endure within the social and economic and legal structures of society long after many people have been able to set aside their obvious racial biases. So I think it's a very positive thing.
I want to go back to the historical focus. Could you talk a little bit about Belgium and King Leopold?
Yeah. King Leopold of Belgium in the late 19th century got a hold of a big chunk of Africa as an individual. It wasn't the Belgian government, it was King Leopold as an individual who was in charge of the so-called Belgian, of what became the Belgian Congo. And the Congo River Basin has rubber trees. And rubber was becoming an important product in the late 19th century for bicycle tires and car tires and so forth. And so Leopold gave charters to particular companies that they were granted access to the rubber trees of a particular region of the Congo. And they took advantage of this. They went in there, they kidnapped people, they forced them to go out and harvest the rubber. They had to bring in so much or there would be punishments. I've seen pictures of young children with their hands amputated because their parents did not bring in enough rubber. It was a horrendous thing. It caused a great scandal in Europe. And by the early 20th century, it was suppressed. And the Belgian government took over the administration of the Congo. So that particular horror was relatively short lasting, but the image of it and the racism inherent in it has long been cited as an example of European racism and the policies of empire.
Can you speak a little bit to the issues of, with, around media and the control of information and the creation of fear, which creates separatism? I've heard that in the United States, only 25% of the people own a passport, so have never really gone out of the country to know other cultures. And somebody talked about those who control the media and own the media control the minds of the people.
Yeah.
Yep.
Huge.
Well,
Oh, yeah.
But
the
fear
media,
is
of course,
fear.
is a double-edged sword. The media has given popularity to the civil rights movement and all sorts of other things that we might consider positive. So, but it's an open system, more or less. And there are, of course, currently debates about what counts as legitimate expression. Hate crimes are not supposed to be, I'm sorry, hate-filled language is not supposed to appear on public media, and yet drawing that line is a very difficult thing. So it's a megaphone that works for many different groups.
The separation between the rich and the poor, that's a very distinguished thing. If you're well off and you're comfortable, you can afford to have all these luxuries that we have here, and then the poor are always being discriminated against. They're the slave class. You go into the military, it's the poor people that make it up, regardless of what their color is. In this country, it's more so. And there you see a lack of this prejudice against people when the poor are aware of their own poverty compared to being discriminated against somebody, not being able to become educated, not having to be poor is poor. And that's hard, and you're very aware of the prejudice and the discrimination against.
Yeah. And poverty and race have often overlapped.
Just on that, just to translate racism into prejudice. Because then it it makes it so it applies to a lot more people that are prejudiced against and are not given the same equal opportunity. It's
Okay,
just prejudice.
okay,
And it seems to, we've always thought racism and prejudice were kind of related.
yes. And those things have a staying power, even when the laws change.
Dr. Stewart, when you have the chronology up, you know, you saw the ape, you saw the African, and you saw the European, and when you were talking about historically how the Africans were migrated over to the North Americans, could you comment, why was it focused on the continent of Africa so much? Why not Asia? Why not somewhere else? What historically do you, and I know it wasn't one thing, but why did it focus so much on Africa and not like Asia or somewhere else?
Well, it did focus more widely.
Whoops, you can-
I think one reason that discussions of race have focused largely on Africa in this country has to do with slavery. Now, of course, in China, where they are at odds with the Uyghurs and the Tibetans and so forth, that issue is not so predominant. Some people have argued that the way the British treated the Irish well before the slave trade was a model for how they treated Africans once the slave trade got going. There are people who argue that British treatment of the Irish, who are technically white, and was a model for how they dealt with Africans once they encountered them. Furthermore, there was a lot of active racially based discrimination against Southern and Eastern Europeans, Jews, Italians.
Germans, they're very much against Irish, very much. They
Okay,
considered them inferior, they wouldn't help them,
okay.
anything.
But over time, of course, they have become racially white, whereas earlier they were not. So this illustrates the notion of race as a social construct which has a history, which can change. Some people who are biologically or from skin coloring white have been discriminated against racially in earlier times and now are not so much.
It's amazing to me that humans use this justification for the way they behave to other humans. And trying to make it like,
As ever.
yeah.
And non-humans.
Power, somebody said, is never exercised naked. Power is always clothed in some rhetoric that serves to justify it. And race is one such clothing for power. Pete?
And speaking of that rhetoric, you haven't mentioned the vocabulary, the use of word that accompanies one group's claim to have superiority over another one. And I'm thinking particularly of references to vermin or insects or that sort of thing. I thought originally it's an odd setup of racism. The Hutus and the Tutsis in Africa. They do have physical differences generally, and they were referred to each other, particularly the Hutus, about the Tutsis, that they were insects. They were vermin. I think there are lots of other synonyms for that sort of.
I understood from the short time I visited South Africa,
And
there's many different tribes. I understood a short visit to South Africa. There's many different tribes, and and that they were fighting each other all the time instead of uniting. It was just really sad to know that, but
Mhm.
again, it's
It-
human nature is amazing what they do with themselves.
It is
I think it's
probably,
so much better for everybody to be just kind to each other.
well, yes.
And the point that you brought up about Berman and the connect, you know, the association with that is being bad, the thing that comes to my mind is to non-human beings on the earth. I mean, there's a lot of very intelligent, non-human critters out there. I mean, whales and elephants, they're very, very.
And horses,
And horses, they're very
learned
intelligent.
a lot from mine.
And we are. It's hard to see racism in that association, but definitely prejudice. We put them
Yes, yes,
into a slavery incarceration.
yeah. It's an interesting question of how important it is to make distinctions between racial discrimination, religious discrimination, species discrimination. All of those are discriminatory, but at least from a scholar's point of view, they are different. Miles,
I just like to point out that part of the I just like to point out that part of the reason perhaps that Europe decided that Africa was the country that they'd take off of and kind of steal from for slavery or whatever was because they had decided that or they had seen that because Europe was they didn't want to expend military power if they tried to take people from Asia or a different country. Perhaps it would have been more difficult to do so because these countries were more developed and they had more of a connection. Africa was just a lot of tribes, and they were all very independent of each other. So it was easy to just create chaos, which they could then take from without having to use large military power. And obviously the justifications for that I think came after, but maybe from a source of practicality, like they knew that that was going to be the easiest way.
well, Miles,
Yeah, but it was.
I think not so, if you'll forgive me, but during the slave trade era, the Europeans did not have this overwhelming military power that they acquired later. And during the slave trade era from about 1500 to the mid-19th century, when Europeans did try to go into the interior, they were often countered by and defeated by African armies. So they learned that it wasn't necessary for Europeans to militarily capture slaves, which they very seldom did. They simply waited on the coast until they were brought down to the coast by African merchants and political leaders. Now, by the end of the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution kicked in a military way, they did have the power and they did conquer Africa militarily. That was not the case during the slave trade era.
Was the only Africans against themselves.
I'm sorry?
It was Africans against themselves, kind of doing each other in.
Well, yes, except that they generally did not sell their own people. They sold other people's people.
Yeah.
And there was no overall African identity. Okay,
I just think we talk globally, but if we look locally, we can really see racism that abounds in Pajaro with the floods and how many of us went to help. And people know about the Buena Vista labor camp that sits by where the dump, you know,
Yeah.
it's a labor camp that those people pick our food for us. And if we look really locally, La Selva Beach was started, and there's a covenants that was started that said that only whites could buy property here.
Oh, my
And
God.
blacks and brown people that could be here, but only as house helpers or gardeners.
okay.
That covenant still exists in the county laws in the 50s. The people that were living here had that change, but it's when you buy your property, it's still listed
Oh,
in
my
there.
God.
So, and Aptos, the same way, was
was it?
whites only,
Mhm.
whites only, unless they were gardeners or housekeepers.
Hmm.
So we're living it right here, and we may not even know it.
Okay,
So it's San Francisco too, going to keep out these people.
Right.
Okay.
It's horrible.
I know you say it started from the 1500s, your lecture, but simple fact is that human history is a history of slavery as much as anything, you know. And it was a discriminator. You could slave anybody that was less weak, less stronger than you. That's the way it is.
Yeah.
But it pretty much, I think it's the way it is today.
But the point I was making is that slavery was not everywhere associated with race. Greek and Roman slavery was non-racial.
Yeah.
They
Especially the Romans.
they enslaved anybody they captured.
Yep.
And scholars generally have found that there is little anti-black feeling among these ancient classical civilizations of Europe. It doesn't excuse the slavery, but it simply means that slavery and racism do not always go together. They did in the Americas, and that's what makes it unique. Okay, well, many thanks. And Merry Christmas
Yeah.
as
Thank you
Advent
for coming,
approaches.
everyone. And thank you, Dr. Strayer, for his wonderful talks. In January, we'll have this sort of led right into it on climate change. And the local efforts about, so John Hunt will be giving those on the 2nd and on the 20th of January, at the same time on a Saturday at 11.
Do you have to reserve or?
No, it'll be just like Dr. Strayer's.
Cool.
It will be offered hybrid. So if you want to listen to it from home, I don't know what the weather's gonna be like in January, but we'll see.
Just a reminder, when you put something, whoever puts them in the over, get the dates and times, and the last 2 times they have it.
They didn't do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, what's for the events?
Yeah, but
They
this-
just did list the dates and times,
This is on their website.
but it wasn't in the